Hey folks, how y'all doing? Today in Game Geeks, we're going to be talking about Adventures in Middle-earth, the Loremaster's Guide. This is the companion piece to the Player's Guide, which came out earlier that we reviewed some time ago. Go back and watch it. It's pretty decent. You know, the guy who does it is kind of a jerk, but still, it's worth watching. Oh, wait. Oh, hey, you're back. So, this is the Loremaster's Guide. What this does is it basically expands on a lot of the things that are in the Player's Guide and makes them bigger. This also has some of what you would expect from this sort of a Loremaster's Guide because they're not making a specific monster manual, but I present to you they really don't need to because Tolkien's works weren't exactly filled with all the things that we're used to seeing in Dungeons & Dragons. So, we're going to start at the beginning here with it, that the opening of it gives you some advice on how to be a GM, and specifically how to be a GM in a Tolkien-esque world. One of the things that was in there that I found particularly enlightening was it sort of advises you not to be too hidebound to the canon. As they point out, when Tolkien was alive, he was constantly rewriting things, messing with things, noodling with it here or there, so that you should feel free to do the same thing with your game. Do not be overly hidebound to what was already written and what's there. I know a lot of Tolkien fans who are very rigid about that sort of thing. Now, that being said, I wouldn't exactly recommend bringing in Slotty or Illithids into your Tolkien game because that would set everything on its ear. But you can expand outward a bit more creatively than you would initially think. So in addition to some decent GM advice and specifically, Loremaster advice, and specifically as applied to the Tolkien world, it then kind of expands outward from there on getting set up for your game. It expands outward from there on knowing your material well enough, basing your descriptions on what is already there. Read the books, which is probably a very crucial thing in this because it is based on such a well-known literary source. With Lovecraft, there was so much going on that you could really pull in from anywhere you wanted to and any of the pastiche writers or his colleagues. But this, you've really got one voice. And you've got one voice you've got to work everything on. At the end of that introductory section, it gives you sort of the Wildlands setting, which is where it assumes you're going to set your game, and then a specific map of Lake Town for reasons that sort of befuddled me for a while. The only one I can come up with is I think they assume that will be your home base for a period of time in that particular area you're working. So another thing it brings up in setting your games here is realize that the years are long, that this is a very long-term game. Millennia have passed since things have happened, and that journeys take a while, and they take a while to get to where you are going. So it expands outward on the adventuring phase, which is one of the big questions that I had earlier in my first review, which is what the hell do you do in the adventuring phase? Well, this kind of tells you. And while it shies away from straight-up dungeon crawls, it does give you options like exploring cave systems, ruined cities, wilderness adventures, etc. And decent advice on how to build off of those. One of the things that brings up in the adventuring phase is there are no long rests while you are on a journey. So, or while you're in an adventure, because it brings up what you need from a Tolkien point of view for a long rest, which are creature comforts, which is safety, a sanctuary that you're probably not going to get while you're sleeping by the side of the road waiting for more orcs to attack you. So I do like that it sets it up that way. It also points out that most of the time you don't want to directly and openly engage the forces of shadow because that brings attention to yourself. You want to do things more subtly, sneak around them, only fight defensively when you absolutely have to. Another section in this book that I liked was bringing your surroundings into combat and giving you ideas for how to use it. For example, if you're in a forest and there are giant tree trunks, you can hide behind them. If there are trees with low branches, you climb up. High ground versus low ground, rocky slopes, that it can take an enemy its entire movement just to get on top of the rock, and then you have an advantage on attacking them since they're distracted by things like not trying to fall off. Also things for the environment, weather effects, just the weird creepiness that's going around in some places, the sort of ickiness that the forces of shadow bring with it. I thought that was a very, very nice addition that I could see porting into other settings in D&D 5th edition if you really wanted to. That's one of the more versatile pieces of this game. And then it gives you ideas for what to do during the seeking an audience. Who are you talking to? What level of power do they have? And as sort of a stimulus response, if you do this, then they're likely to do that. For example, when you're speaking to a chieftain or a lord and that they lie to you and you catch it, you're in pretty deep doo-doo. There is a bestiary of sorts, sort of what you would expect, but it gives you several flavors of orcs and goblins, wargs and other wolves, werewolves and vampires, which I was not aware was a thing in Tolkien work, but apparently it is. As I've mentioned in my last review, I'm not exactly a big Tolkien scholar. Gives you non-player characters that you can interact with. Overall, and I'm sorry, not overall, it then wraps it up toward the end with bringing in magic into your game. There's a nice section on wondrous legendary items, and it gives you an effect on who forged them. Was it made by elves? Was it made by Dunedain? Or was it made by dwarves? And then sort of how you use those individual items toward a specific purpose. Most of the time it's Banes. It's particularly effective against a blank. So it's particularly effective against orcs or giant spiders or werewolves, I suppose, if that's your thing. I also like that in this, the powers of the items expand outward as you gain in level. So essentially you divide your proficiency bonus in half, and that is where that's the number of these sort of advantages or these extra levels of power that your weapon can have. So it's no longer, well, it's just a +1 sword, but I got a +3 over here. Now there's a reason for keeping it because it grows with you, albeit rather slowly. There is a section toward the end here on bringing in true magic into your game, which I know raises the hackles of a lot of players. As the book itself points out, there's subtle magic worked in everywhere with some of the things that elves can do. It's sort of a subtle magic that's already there. This will never bring in fireballs and lightning bolts and cloud kill like we're used to in D&D 5th. That is just not setting appropriate here. But it does give you more options, especially for those of you, and I mentioned this earlier in my first review, that are concerned that there's not enough magic there to appease the normal magic-happy players. And yes, I am completely aware that is not within the ethos, and it's not within the writings of Tolkien himself. But there have been certain things in fantasy role-playing that we have become so accustomed to seeing that it raises eyebrows and uncomfortable levels when they're not there. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. I like the fact that they give you options here while keeping it within the overall theme. So, really, what do we have here? This is definitely the companion piece. Further adventures for 5th edition D&D are promised, although not directly so. It's a bit more subtle when you have to look for it. Additionally, I sort of enjoy the fact that it rounds it out and gives you more options for the game while keeping within the Tolkien feel. I think the sort of using terrain to your advantage or disadvantage is worth the price of admission alone. And I think that if you are really interested in running a directly Tolkien-inspired or at least Tolkien-themed game, this is definitely a book you need to have. So I really like it. It's a good companion piece. I recommend getting it if you're really into Middle-earth and you want to play in that genre, especially if you miss things like MERP. Have a good time gaming, y'all.